Welcome back to Journey of Self-Awareness, your YouTube channel for personal growth and self-exploration. I'm your host, Tado-san Harmon, and today we want to continue my discussion of kind of broad genres of spiritual practices by talking about surrendering to the divine, which involves foregoing the self, or foregoing a sense of self, or renouncing the self. Now, I suppose I should say at the beginning here that there are many paths up the mountain, so after watching this video, if you decide that surrendering to the divine isn't right for you, then you should simply move on and choose another practice, because as I said before, there are so many spiritual practices that all dovetail and work cooperatively with one another, that it's very important to choose the practice that's right for you. All rivers lead to the sea, and while it's important to find a practice that's right for you, surrender has a great deal to recommend it. Before we get into the details about surrendering to the divine, maybe we should go back and recap a little bit and talk about some of the preliminary elements of a daily practice that I've discussed in the last few videos. You remember that I said that daily spiritual practice can lead to profound sense of inner peace and fulfillment, but only if you do it for the right reasons. It's so important that we check our motives and our intentions for a daily practice. And of course, the highest motive, the highest intention, is when we embark on a spiritual path and practice with the noble intention of being of benefit to others. This, as I've said, takes the emphasis off of the self and puts it rightly on the benefit of others. And we want to conduct a spiritual practice so that we can ultimately be the greatest benefit to the widest number of beings. That is, our goal should be to awaken to the true nature of reality and discover our own divinity, because that's the very best way that we can be the most benefit to others, that we can become the greatest positive force in the lives of others. And so if we make our aim to benefit others and make that our highest intention, then it's crucially important for us to cultivate a sense of compassion and kindness for all beings. I suggest that you incorporate your well wishes for others into your practice and do it every day. This is such an important aspect of every spiritual path, not just in the East, but all around the world. I should also add that in many spiritual and shamanic traditions, seekers will begin a daily practice by creating a sacred space and sacred time, by opening a sacred space, which is partly about finding the right setting for your spiritual practices, but it's also partly about conducting rituals that help to demarcate sacred time and sacred space in your daily life. Some practitioners will do this by setting up an altar that is just there for practicing, or we'll have a special room in the home for this, or remember, part of the setting, part of the importance of setting is that we're creating a refuge from worldly concerns from the outside world that's conducive to meditation, to contemplation, and self-introspection. So, for example, Native Americans might use smudging where they burn sage to cleanse a person or a space of negative energy. They might create a sacred circle with stones or feathers or other natural objects that will delineate and demark a sacred space that's a protected space. It's protected from negative energies. And see, in other traditions, Buddhists, for example, might call in the guru from afar or visualize what they call a field of merit, the vast array of awakened beings that surround us, including their version of the angels and what they call the dakinis, for example. I won't say a whole lot more about this, but you should know that there are very, very many practices for creating sacred space that you can learn about on your own, and it's something you might want to incorporate. It's a way of separating the ordinary and the mundane from the profound and the sacred. So let's see. I also suggest that at the beginning of your day, you take a few moments and contemplate or reflect upon the 4 thoughts that turn the mind that we discussed a few videos ago. These are also known as the 4 remembrances. And I hope you've been studying them in greater detail because they help us provide the encouragement that we need to establish the proper attitudes and the motives for our spiritual practice, and to continue the practice and go the mile and to stay on the path and to not deviate and to not neglect our spiritual duties. Just to summarize in short, at the beginning of every session, we should remember how precious it is for us to have this opportunity to practice and to follow a spiritual path. And we should feel immensely grateful for the opportunities that we have to practice. And we should also take a moment to reflect on the transient nature of life and our wealth and our relationships and even the temporary nature of our bodies. We should remember that nothing is permanent. It's all transient and passing away, especially our sense of a separate self. That is also transient, and it's not going to last. And that's part of the goal of conducting spiritual practices, is to overcome this sense of a separate self and to transcend that. So being aware of impermanence is, it helps us let go of our attachments to worldly things. It helps us to focus on what's truly important, what is truly lasting and permanent. And this is a great benefit for spiritual practice. The Buddha, of course, and all of the Buddhist traditions emphasize reflecting upon and contemplating impermanence. This has a lot going for it. Now you'll recall that I said before, many times before, that identification with the sense of a separate self is the very definition of suffering. It's the source of all of our ills, and escaping that and loosening the grip of the separate self and escaping the sense of a separate self or transcending the sense of a separate self. This is among the most important things that we can possibly do, because it's how we will be part of the solution for others instead of being part of the problem for them. It's so surrender is fundamental here. It helps us break free of this cycle of suffering that's caused by our attachments to worldly concerns and transient worldly pleasures and possessions and ultimately leading to a state of fulfillment and inner peace. And when we reflect on the suffering that's inherent in the cycles of everyday life, practicing surrender then becomes a way to renounce that suffering, to overcome that suffering, and to move beyond that suffering. Of course, regular spiritual practices include elements that are designed to help us challenge our habitual identification with a sense of a separate self, a solid self, which can include, as we've talked about, meditation practices that help us observe the transient nature of our own thoughts and emotions, the transient nature of our sensations and things that we're experiencing over time. Spiritual practices can include devotional practices that also cultivate surrender to a higher power, and self-inquiry techniques that question the nature of the I. These are the sort of self-inquiry techniques that are common in many spiritual traditions, of course, which were greatly popularized by Ramana Maharshi. So daily spiritual practices are so important because they increase self-awareness, they help us recognize our egoic patterns, they simultaneously cultivate qualities that are positive, like humility and compassion and non-attachment. In short, daily spiritual practices gradually wear down the ingrained habits and beliefs that reinforce a sense of separation, isolation, division from what is. They help clear the obstacles to enlightenment, what the Tibetans call the intellectual and the emotional obscurations to enlightenment, or self-realization, or awakening, or whatever term you want to use for it. If you'll recall, I also mentioned in my last video that there's a lot of overlap among various spiritual practices, or what I've been calling these genres of spiritual practices, that the genres may contain, different genres may contain the same practices, and so some practice may appear in multiple genres. And for example, I suggested earlier today that surrender can be viewed as a devotional practice that strengthens one's connection to the divine, and rituals that involve making offerings to the divine, for example, or establishing a home shrine, they also serve a similar purpose, because offerings to the divine are also a way for us to express devotion and to surrender. So there's a great deal of overlap, and we just need to realize that these spiritual practices form a symbiotic relationship and help support one another. And when we incorporate different types of spiritual practices into our daily session, they will help us immensely to go the mile, to make steady progress on a spiritual path. Surrender can also be seen as a purification practice, as a way to purify our minds and our hearts, and to overcome our selfish desires and our egoic tendencies. But of course, the point of all these spiritual practices is to lead us to greater clarity, to inner peace, calm, and to grow spiritually. And as I mentioned, they are powerfully effective at doing that. So now, let me take a different tack and approach surrender from the Bhakti path, which is originated in ancient India and has had profound influence, not just in India, but in other spiritual traditions. And you'll find elements of Bhakti, for example, in Sufism and in other traditions. Bhakti emphasizes total surrender to the will of God, and it emphasizes cultivating an intense love for the divine, and it's, as I mentioned, it's a central aspect of many traditions. You'll find this in Christianity, singing the praises of God, cultivating the love of God, and surrendering to the divine will. So Bhakti practitioners utilize many of the same things we talked about: devotion and prayer and surrender, to develop an intimate, personal, close, and deeply loving relationship with the divine. They will often engage in such practices as devotedly chanting the name of God, and like other spiritual traditions, Bhakti encourages surrendering the ego and forgoing one's own will and initiative, and accepting the will of the divine. So we surrender our will to the will of God, if you will. This is just like as you find among many Christians who surrender to the will of God, who advocate discipleship and discipline to the will of God, and just as you'll find in Christianity, the Bhakti act of surrender, it's not a passive act, it's a active acceptance of a divine plan. It's trusting that everything is going to be okay. You can surrender everything and allow the universe to unfold, because it'll help you develop faith then that the universe will unfold for the highest good, ultimately for the highest good. So we can let go of our daily concerns. The Christian expression is let go and let God. Turn it over to God. This is an act of surrender. And as I mentioned, it's highly recommended. Now, so in addition to establishing a deeply personal and emotional relationship with the divine, surrender is absolutely crucial. On a Bhakti path, devotees surrender the ego. They give up their desires. They give up their attachments. They offer their entire self to God. Their body, their mind, their soul, everything, they offer it to the divine. They give it up. So I should say that this act of surrender is not seen as an act of weakness. No, instead it's a way to transcend the limitations of the ego and feel united, a deep sense of connection with the divine. Now, if you want to incorporate surrender into your daily practice, I suggest you begin with a foundational practice of simply surrendering to a higher power or a divine presence. Not all of you are going to like to use the term God. You can think of it as surrendering to transcendent principles, if you like, but this act of surrendering to a higher power or to the divine, it sets the stage for our spiritual journey by encouraging us to let go of ego-driven attachments and embrace a greater purpose that's beyond ourselves, that's greater than ourselves, that's larger than ourselves. So, of course, as I've said, in so many spiritual traditions around the world, surrendering to a higher power is considered essential for spiritual growth and awakening. It's the central theme in so many spiritual traditions, and as we've said, it involves letting go of our attachment to the egoic self. It involves letting go of the ego's need for control and trusting in something greater than oneself. Recognizing that there's a greater purpose or meaning to life, and allowing divine guidance to lead the way. It's about getting out of the way and letting the divine operate in our lives. That may be another way of putting it. And so trust is key here. It's the act of surrender builds trust in a higher power, in the divine, encouraging us to release our need for control, for controlling the outcomes, for being in charge. And this act of surrender then creates space for the divine to flow, for wisdom to flow. It brings clarity and guidance and support in times of uncertainty. And you may be surprised at how often auspicious events just occur in your life. And when we surrender to a higher power, as I mentioned, we develop a deeper faith and we learn to trust in the process of life. Even in the moments of challenge or in suffering, we recognize that the divine is at work in our lives, and we can trust the divine. We can do what we feel is necessary, of course, but with faith that everything is going to be okay, that it's all going to work out in the end. So surrender allows us to align with the will of a higher power and allow life to unfold with a sense of harmony, with a sense of grace, and with a greater purpose than our own selfish personal desires or attachments. And if you watched my previous videos, you'll know that the egoic self constantly seeks control and approval and external validation and its own security. And so surrendering and letting go of the ego, it weakens the grip of the egoic self and this solid sense of a separate self. It weakens our identification with the ego, and as I mentioned earlier, it even weakens our identification with the physical body. This bears repeating, of course. The act of surrendering helps us dissolve the inherent boundaries associated with the ego. It helps us realize the emptiness of the separate self and to live from a place of openness and authenticity and inner peace. And of course, it also fosters humility. Surrender is also very similar to renunciation, which we find in very many spiritual traditions, but it's more or less a baby step toward renunciation. Renunciation, of course, is a voluntary giving up or letting go of all of our worldly attachments and desires and our ego-driven pursuits, and in pursuit of higher ideal or higher spiritual goals. Renunciation often involves taking solemn vows of poverty, for example, in a monastic setting. It can involve relinquishing all of our material possessions and our emotional attachments and our identification with the self in order to attain spiritual enlightenment or liberation or union with the divine. But it's important because it enables us to free ourselves from the burdens of attachments and desires and the ego, which are, of course, obstacles on the spiritual path. And by isolating ourselves from the outside world, for example, and renouncing all of our worldly desires and our attachments, we can redirect our energies and focus our energies on personal growth and spiritual attainment and self-realization. But most of us are not ready for vows of poverty, for example. So, what should we surrender? Surrender can involve visualizing or imagining surrendering everything. And this is what I'm going to suggest. Surrender everything, including all of your emotional baggage and all of your negative self-talk. Surrender everything associated with a sense of a separate self. All of your attachments, your aversions, your desires, your worries. Surrender your past, surrender your future, surrender your problems, your goals, your aspirations, your fears. I mean, turn everything over to the divine. Give everything to God, including all of the trauma and the anger and the resentments and the grief and any guilt or shame you might feel in your life. Let it all go and trust that everything is going to be okay. It's all going to be okay. So surrender serves as a way to strip away the layers of the egoic illusion that veil our true nature, the true nature of our reality. So surrender helps us then to realize our own inherent divinity and to attain union with the divine. It's a powerfully transformative process that ultimately leads to profound spiritual growth and liberation from the confines of mundane reality. This is a way of achieving liberation, which of course is our highest purpose, our greatest calling in life. Through surrender, we can deepen our spiritual journey. We can balance our detachment from the world with devotion to the divine. We can fulfill our duties to our families and our friends and our employers while also relinquishing the desires of the self. This combination of surrender on the one hand and love on the other, it fosters a profound transformation of our consciousness. It leads to fulfillment and inner peace and, as I said, union with the divine. So in your daily practice, focus on cultivating love, devotion, and surrender to the divine, whatever form that takes for you. In today's fast-paced, modern, and often stressful world, many of us are yearning for emotional fulfillment, a sense of connection beyond our material or worldly concerns, and a well-designed daily spiritual practice will go a long way to carrying you forward. So while you're at this, please don't forget a daily meditation to cultivate mindfulness and insights, and be sure to dedicate the merit or the value of your spiritual practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. And remember, our spiritual practices have the power to fundamentally reshape our realities, to transform our realities. So the takeaway is that surrender and devotion to the divine are catalysts for meditation and self-realization to work hand in hand with the fundamental cornerstones of a daily spiritual practice that we've talked about before. This is another point that bears repeating. These spiritual practices all work together in a symbiotic relationship to support one another and carry us far down the path. Well, that's all I really wanted to say today. Of course, I didn't talk about specific spiritual practices that fall within this genre of surrender. As I've said before, there are very, very many of them in multiple spiritual traditions around the world, and you can research these on your own. But just this act of surrendering to the divine, and you could fabricate your own tradition, if you like, in this genre. But I encourage you to consider incorporating surrender into your daily practice. Well, thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button, like the video if you liked it, and be sure to tell your friends about it so it supports the channel. We'll see you next week right here on Journey of Self-Awareness. Bye-bye.